I want you to stop, like, whatever you are doing right now and just consider a totally wild, almost unbelievable statistic.
Oh, this is a good one. Yeah.
Right. So, if you live an average lifespan, you are going to spend roughly 6 entire years of your life in a state of complete, vivid hallucination.
6 full years.
6 years. And during that time, your brain is going to generate over, 100,000 completely fabricated realities.
Yeah, and you will inhabit them completely.
Exactly. You inhabit them, you believe them, you will feel terror, joy, confusion, awe inside them. And the kicker,
The forgetting part.
yes, for the vast majority of those 100,000 realities, you are going to forget them within seconds of opening your eyes.
It's one of the most staggering facts of human biology, honestly.
It really is.
We spend years immersed in this entirely internally generated virtual reality. Yet, because it's so universal, so routine, we completely normalize it. We just brush it off. We call it dreaming.
Right. We just wake up, shake it off, and go pour our coffee like it's nothing. But today, for this deep dive, we are not just shaking it off. We are diving into a massive stack of research like the absolute bleeding edge of sleep science, evolutionary biology, and neuroscience.
Which is fascinating stuff.
It really is. And we are using it to unpack one of humanity's oldest and honestly most stubborn mysteries. Why do we dream?
And it remains a profound mystery. I want to ground our conversation in that reality right at the start.
Yeah, that's important.
Think about the scope of modern scientific progress, right? We have mapped the human genome.
Right.
We have sent rovers to Mars. We can track the electrical firing of individual neurons in real time.
Which is insane.
It is.
Yeah.
And yet, the nightly theater that plays out inside your own skull remains one of the most fiercely debated frontiers in all of science.
Well, I am thrilled to unpack this today because the source material is absolutely mind-bending.
It really turns everything you thought you knew upside down.
Yeah. So we are going to take you, the listener, on a journey through the architecture of the night. By the end of this deep dive, you won't just understand what your brain is doing when you close your eyes.
No, you'll understand why you forget these experiences.
Right, and why your brain sometimes tortures you with nightmares, and how you can actually harness your own sleep architecture to remember your dreams or even control them.
Because the sleeping brain is not resting. It is working at an incredibly high level of metabolic and electrical output.
So let's start with the foundation then. Before we can understand the dream itself, we have to understand the stage it's built on.
Right, the architecture.
Because I used to think of sleep as an off switch, You get into bed, flip the switch, the brain powers down into this sort of dormant standby mode, and then 8 hours later, the alarm rings, and you power back up.
Yeah, and that assumption is incredibly common, and it is entirely incorrect.
Completely wrong.
Sleep is not a static state of unconsciousness. Think of the ocean. From the surface, it just looks like a flat expanse of water.
Right, nothing going on.
Exactly. But beneath the surface, there are shifting currents, varying depths, distinct thermal layers, entirely different ecosystems.
Wow, okay.
Sleep is a highly structured, dynamic 90-minute roller coaster that you ride down and up multiple times a night.
And the timeline of how we discovered this is fascinating, mostly because of how recently it happened.
Oh, it's incredibly recent.
Right. Like, humans have been sleeping for hundreds of thousands of years, but we had absolutely no idea what was happening until roughly the 1920s. We were literally and scientifically in the dark.
Yeah, in 1929, a German psychiatrist named Hans Berger invented the EEG.
The electroencephalogram.
That's the one. But the funny part is, he was actually trying to find the biological basis for telepathy.
Wait, really? Telepathy?
Yes, which sounds absurd now. But it drove him to invent a machine that records the electrical activity of the brain through electrodes placed on the scalp.
Oh, wow. So he invented this incredible tool for a totally bizarre reason.
Exactly. So for the first time, researchers didn't have to just stare at a sleeping person's face. They could look at the electrical signature of their brain.
And the expectation was what? That it would just be a flat line.
Pretty much.
Mm.
They expected the EEG to show a very quiet, slow hum of a brain completely powered down.
But the readouts showed something completely different.
Completely different. The sleeping brain was electrically exploding with rich, varied activity.
Even so, the specific breakthrough regarding dreaming didn't happen for another 2 decades, right?
Yeah, it took until 1953. At the University of Chicago, a sleep researcher named Nathaniel Kleitman and his graduate student, Eugene Ezerinsky, were monitoring sleeping subjects.
Right, the classic sleep lab setup.
Yeah. And they noticed something utterly bizarre. Periodically, every 90 minutes or so, the sleeping person's eyes would start darting around wildly beneath their closed eyelids.
Rapid eye movement. REM sleep.
Yes. So Kleitman and Azarinsky started waking people up right in the middle of these rapid eye movements.
And what happened?
Almost every single time, the subject woke up and said they were right in the middle of a vivid story.
But when they woke them up during the quiet eye periods,
The subjects rarely reported any narrative. That was the singular moment we definitively linked a specific biological state to the psychological experience of dreaming.
okay, so let's walk through this 90-minute roller coaster for the listener. What actually happens when you turn out the lights and close your eyes?
Well, the research divides the night into 4 distinct stages.
Right, stages 1, 2, and 3 are non-REM sleep, and stage 4 is REM sleep.
Let's begin at the gateway. Stage 1, or NREM1. This only lasts about 5 to 10 minutes. You're transitioning.
Just drifting off.
Exactly. Your brain waves start to slow down from the high-frequency beta waves of waking life, moving into slower alpha and theta waves. Your muscles are relaxing, your heart rate drops. You are floating right on the fragile border of consciousness.
Oh, this is where the physical glitches happen.
Yes.
I'm talking about hypnic jerks. That sudden, terrifying sensation of falling that jolts you awake and your whole body spasms. I mean, I've literally spilled water on my nightstand because of this.
So many people do.
What is the mechanism there? Why do we jerk awake?
The mechanism is a fascinating miscommunication in the nervous system. As you drift into stage 1, your muscles rapidly lose their waking tension.
Okay, they relax.
Right. However, deeper, more primitive parts of your brain are still semi-awake. When they detect this sudden dramatic slackening of the muscles, they misinterpret the signal.
They think something is wrong.
Yes, the brain thinks, well, my muscles are entirely flat, gravity is taking over, I must be falling.
Wow.
It's likely a vestige from our evolutionary ancestors sleeping in trees. To save you from hitting the ground, the brain fires a massive reflexive electrical signal to contract your muscles and catch yourself.
That makes total sense. I mean, it's terrifying in a modern bed, but evolutionarily, that's brilliant.
It really is.
You also get hypnagogic hallucinations in this stage, right?
Yes, very frequently.
It's not a full narrative dream yet. It's highly visual flashes of imagery, geometric patterns, or maybe a sudden face appearing. And I loved this detail from the source. The artist Salvador Dali weaponized this specific neurostate.
He was a genius at hacking his own brain.
He really was. He would deliberately sit in a chair holding a heavy metal key over a tin plate on the floor.
Right.
He would let himself drift off, moving into stage 1 sleep. And the moment his muscles fully relaxed,
His hand would go limp.
exactly, his hand would go limp, the key would drop, hit the plate, and the crash would jolt him awake instantly. He would grab his sketch pad and draw the bizarre, unfiltered images he had just seen.
He essentially hacked the transitional sleep cycle for surrealist art.
Which is incredible.
It is. But if you don't drop a key, however, you sink deeper into stage 2, NREM2. You spend about half of your total night in this stage.
Half the night. Okay, and the defining feature of stage 2 is something called sleep spindles,
Yes, sleep spindles.
which are short bursts of high-frequency electrical activity lasting less than a second. But why is the brain suddenly spiking its electrical output if it's supposed to be resting?
Because those sleep spindles are the physical mechanism of memory consolidation.
Ah, so filing away today.
Precisely. During the day, you absorb information, and it sits in a temporary holding area in the hippocampus. It's very fragile there.
Like RAM in a computer.
Great analogy, yes. During stage 2 sleep, the brain actively transfers this information from short-term storage into the permanent vault of the cortex.
And the spindle is how it does that.
A sleep spindle is literally a massive influx of calcium ions rapidly oscillating between the thalamus and the cortex, which triggers synaptic plasticity. The spindle is the physical manifestation of a memory being permanently wired into your brain.
So your brain is doing some serious, heavy cognitive lifting.
Huge amounts of work.
Once the files are transferred, you drop down into the basement. Stage 3, NREM3, or deep sleep.
The physical repair shop.
Yeah, that's what the source material calls it, the physical repair shop.
It is the most physiologically restorative phase. Your brain waves slow down to massive rolling delta waves. You are profoundly disconnected from the outside world.
So if you wake up here, you're a mess.
Yes, if an alarm goes off during stage 3, you will wake up feeling groggy, confused, and physically heavy, a state called sleep inertia.
But the mechanism of what happens inside the brain during stage 3 is what blew my mind. I've always heard about the glymphatic system acting as a biological dishwasher, but I didn't understand how it physically worked until reading this research.
The mechanics are astounding. While you're awake, your neurons are burning energy, and that metabolic process leaves behind waste byproducts, much like a car engine produces exhaust.
Right, just junk building up.
Exactly. One of those byproducts is the beta-amyloid protein. Now, during the day, your brain is too densely packed with active cells to clean this up effectively.
Too much traffic on the roads to run the street sweepers.
Spot on. But when you enter stage 3 deep sleep, the glial cells, the supporting cells around your neurons, actually shrink by up to 60%.
Wait, they physically deflate to create empty space in the brain.
Precisely. They shrink, which opens up the physical channels between the neurons. Then cerebrospinal fluid rushes into these newly opened spaces and power washes the metabolic waste away.
Power washing the brain.
Literally, flushing the beta amyloid down into the circulatory system and eventually to the liver.
And beta amyloid is the exact protein that clumps together to form the plaques found in the brains of Alzheimer's patients.
That is the protein, yes.
So for the listener who regularly skimps on sleep, thinking they can just drink more coffee, they are literally preventing their brain from shrinking its cells and washing away a neurotoxin. They are letting the garbage pile up.
That is the stark biological reality, and it is why chronic sleep deprivation is now viewed as a massive risk factor in dementia research. Deep sleep is not a luxury. It is a critical nightly sanitation cycle.
Man, that is a sobering thought.
It really changes your priorities.
Absolutely. Which brings us to the main event. Stage 4, REM sleep. So you've been asleep for maybe an hour, hour and a half, cycling down through 1, 2, and 3. Then the brain shifts gears entirely.
Entirely. If a researcher looked at your EEG during REM sleep, the readouts are almost indistinguishable from a brain that is wide awake.
Really? It looks awake.
Yes, the slow delta waves of deep sleep are gone. Your brain is generating high-frequency, chaotic, exploding electrical energy. Your heart rate fluctuates wildly. Your breathing becomes irregular. You're experiencing a vivid, intense, simulated reality.
Wait, if the brain is firing as if it's wide awake, and I am running from a tiger in my dream, why aren't my physical legs moving? Why don't I sprint right out of my bed and crash into the bedroom wall?
To prevent exactly that, evolution developed an ingenious biological safety mechanism called REM atonia.
Atonia, so paralysis.
Exactly. As you enter REM sleep, the brainstem sends an active, powerful inhibitory signal down your spinal cord. It completely paralyzes your voluntary muscles. You are locked in place.
So the simulation is running, but the screen is unhooked from the keyboard.
Your brain is running a high-octane simulation, but the hardware connection to your physical limbs is temporarily severed.
That is brilliant. Okay, so we cycle through these 4 stages, 1, 2, 3, REM every 90 minutes. But the architecture of those 90-minute blocks isn't uniform throughout the night. I want to emphasize this for the listener because it completely reframes how we think about waking up early.
Yes, the proportion of each stage shifts dramatically as the night goes on. In your first few 90-minute cycles, say between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., your brain prioritizes that deep, restorative stage 3 sleep.
The power washing.
Right. You might only get 5 or 10 minutes of REM sleep in those early cycles. But as the night progresses toward morning, stage 3 shrinks and REM sleep expands.
That's right.
In your final sleep cycles, just before waking up, a massive chunk of that 90-minute block is pure REM sleep.
So let's do the math on the person who claims they function perfectly fine on 6 hours of sleep instead of 8. If you cut your sleep from 8 hours to 6 hours, you are not just losing 25% of your overall sleep.
No, the math doesn't work that way.
Right. Because REM is backloaded into the final hours of the night, cutting off those last 2 hours might amputate 60% or 70% of your total dreaming time.
You are starving your brain of its most complex, neurologically active state. You might get all your physical repair done in the early hours, but you are drastically shortchanging the cognitive and emotional processing that happens in the morning hours.
Okay, so if REM sleep is the stage, what exactly is the play being put on? We need to understand the bizarre theater of the mind. Why does a dream feel so incredibly real? And why does the weirdest stuff feel completely normal while it's happening?
To answer that, we need to define what a dream actually is from a neuroscientific perspective. The philosopher and cognitive scientist Thomas Metzinger offers a brilliant conceptualization.
What does he say?
He argues that during a dream, the brain isn't just pulling up old memories and projecting them on a screen. It is actively constructing a world model.
A generative simulation.
Yes, exactly. Your brain is building a fully realized three-dimensional reality from scratch, entirely devoid of external sensory input.
Because your eyes are closed.
Your eyes are closed in a dark room, yet you see blinding sunlight. There is no sound, yet you hear symphonies or conversations. You feel the tactile sensation of the ground beneath your feet.
That's wild.
The brain is generating an immersive virtual reality, and within that simulation, you completely believe you are an active participant.
To understand how the brain pulls off this sensory deprivation VR, we have to look at the control board. Because during REM sleep, it is not just random neural noise. Very specific regions of the brain are cranked all the way up, while other regions are turned entirely off.
Yes, let's map the active regions first.
Yeah.
The visual cortex is firing intensely, which generates the vivid imagery.
Makes sense.
The motor cortex is highly active, producing the sensation of movement, even though the spinal cord is blocking the physical execution. The hippocampus, our memory center, is highly engaged, pulling raw material from our lives to populate the dream.
The one that fascinates me is the amygdala.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the amygdala is the brain's threat detection center. It governs fear, anger, anxiety, and intense visceral emotion. The research shows that during REM sleep, the amygdala is up to 30% more active than it is when you are wide awake.
Which perfectly explains the intense emotional load of our dreams. You don't just see a monster, you feel a primal, overwhelming terror.
But here's the part that always tripped me up. You're in this highly emotional, visually vivid world. You are walking a tightrope over a canyon, feeling genuine fear, and suddenly your deceased grandmother floats past you riding a submarine.
Right.
And inside the dream, you don't blink. You just wave and think, oh, she must be heading to the grocery store.
Yes.
How is it that an incredibly complex brain just accepts this absolute physics-defying nonsense as reality?
It accepts it because of the specific region that is turned off.
Uh-huh.
During REM sleep, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is actively suppressed.
I think of the prefrontal cortex as the logic bouncer at the club of your mind.
That's a great way to look at it.
When you're awake, the bouncer stands at the door, evaluating your incoming thoughts. If a thought says, hey, my grandmother is riding a submarine through the sky, the bouncer says, absolutely not. That defies the laws of physics, gravity, and biology. You're not getting in.
Right.
But during REM sleep, the logic bouncer is sent home.
That is a highly accurate analogy. The reality monitoring logical deduction function of your brain is entirely offline. The brain generates a scenario, and without the prefrontal cortex there to flag the contradictions or temporal impossibilities, you accept the scenario at face value.
And we only realize it's crazy when we wake up.
Exactly. It is only when your alarm goes off, you wake up, and blood flow returns to the prefrontal cortex, booting the logic bouncer back online, that you look back at the memory of the dream and realize how utterly absurd it was.
So we have this vivid, uncritical, highly emotional simulator. But what are we actually simulating? Like, are my dreams completely different from your dreams?
Well, the specific details are unique to your life, but the broad narrative structures are staggeringly universal. In the mid-20th century, a researcher named Calvin Hall undertook a monumental project.
What did he do?
He analyzed over 50,000 dream reports from people across various demographics and cultures. He systematically categorized the content to map the universal human dreaming mind.
Analyzing 50,000 dreams is a massive data set. What emerged from that data?
Several striking patterns emerged. First, the most common characters in our dreams are people we know. Family, friends, co-workers. Dreams are intensely social simulations.
Okay, that makes sense.
Second, the themes transcend culture. People everywhere dream of falling, of flying, of being chased by a predator, of arriving at an exam completely unprepared, or of their teeth crumbling and falling out.
The teeth falling out is wild to me. It doesn't matter if you were an executive in Tokyo or a farmer in Ohio. The brain universally uses the sensation of teeth crumbling as a narrative.
It's remarkably consistent.
But the emotional tone of Hall's data is what really caught my attention.
Yes, the overwhelming majority of emotions experienced in those 50,000 dreams were negative.
Really? Mostly negative?
Heavily negative. Fear, anxiety, sadness, and aggression heavily outweigh joy, happiness, or contentment. Being attacked, threatened, or socially humiliated are among the most common narrative structures human beings experience at night.
Which raises an enormous, glaring question. We just established that the brain is expending waking-level energy, burning calories, and temporarily paralyzing the body to build these vivid world models.
Right.
If evolution preserved this incredibly complex state, it must have a profound payoff. So why is the brain using this biological machinery to torture us? Why simulate anxiety and fear every single night?
That question drives the entire field of sleep science. If a behavior is biologically expensive and leaves an organism vulnerable like lying paralyzed in the dark for hours, it must offer a massive survival advantage.
So how do we explain it?
To understand how we explain this today, it helps to see how humanity has historically attempted to answer it.
Right. Let's look at the discarded theories first. Because for most of human history, the universally accepted theory was prophecy.
Yes.
From the ancient Mesopotamians to the Greeks, dreams were understood as messages from the gods, the dead, or the cosmos.
And we shouldn't view that as simple ignorance. Without modern neuroscience or an understanding of unconscious data processing, prophecy is a highly rational hypothesis.
How so?
Think about it. If you dream of an old friend you haven't seen in 10 years, and that you run into them at the market the very next day, what is the most logical explanation to an ancient mind?
Oh, right. The dream must have predicted the future.
Exactly. They didn't know the brain was unconsciously tracking subtle environmental cues or statistical probabilities.
But then we get a massive paradigm shift at the turn of the 20th century. Sigmund Freud writes The Interpretation of Dreams in 1899, and he shifts the source of the dream from the cosmos to the individual unconscious.
Yes, Freud proposed that dreams are the disguised fulfillment of repressed wishes. He argued that we harbor deep, often sexual or aggressive desires that our conscious, civilized mind finds too unacceptable to acknowledge.
So the desires are trying to surface, but if they showed up clearly, we would be horrified and wake up. The brain has to smuggle them in.
Exactly. Freud distinguished between the manifest content, the literal imagery of the dream, like a train going into a tunnel or climbing a staircase, and the latent content, which is the hidden, repressed psychological desire.
The hidden meaning.
Right. He believed the brain uses mechanisms like condensation, where multiple meanings are packed into one symbol, or displacement, where intense emotion is shifted onto a safe, mundane object to protect the sleeper from psychological distress while still venting the desire.
And his disciple, Carl Jung, expanded on this too. Jung argued it wasn't just about personal repressed wishes. He believed in the collective unconscious.
The ancestral layer of the mind.
Yeah, that we share a deep ancestral layer populated by universal archetypes, like the shadow, the hero, or the wise old man. Jung thought dreams were the psyche's attempt to achieve balance, compensating for whatever was lacking in our waking life.
Both Freud and Jung had an immeasurable impact on literature, art, and culture. But from a rigorous, modern scientific perspective, their theories have largely been discarded.
Why is that?
The primary issue is that they failed Karl Popper's test of falsifiability. You cannot design a biological experiment to definitively prove or disprove that a train represents a repressed desire.
Right, it's totally subjective.
However, their core foundational insight that the sleeping mind is performing complex, meaningful, unconscious psychological work was absolutely correct.
But science swung completely in the opposite direction in 1977. The activation synthesis hypothesis, proposed by Hobson and McCarley, I have to say, this is the most depressing theory in the source text.
Is a starkly mechanistic view. Hobson and McCarley argued that dreams are essentially meaningless.
Meaningless?
Yes. Their hypothesis was that during REM sleep, the brainstem fires random bursts of electrical noise. The cerebral cortex, which is biologically driven to make sense of information, receives this random static and frantically tries to stitch it into a coherent narrative.
So on this view, dreams are just the brain's screensaver.
Pretty much. They are a biological byproduct, entirely devoid of inherent psychological meaning.
It's like staring at television static and hallucinating shapes in the snow. The brain is just making up a story to explain the random neural misfires.
Okay.
But modern science has largely moved past that bleak view, too. We now have what we might call the big three overlapping consensus theories. And the first one directly answers the question of why the brain tortures us with nightmares. It's called the threat simulation theory.
Proposed by the Finnish cognitive neuroscientist Antti Revonsuo. He looked at the high activity of the amygdala and the universal themes being chased or attacked, and he viewed it through an evolutionary lens.
Okay.
Ravansuo argued that the brain simulates threats in a virtual environment specifically so you can rehearse your survival responses.
So an anxiety dream is actually evolutionary VR training.
Yes. Think about our ancestral environment. Early humans were hunted by predators, faced hostile rival tribes, and navigated dangerous physical terrain. An early human whose brain ran a vivid VR simulation of being stalked by a leopard every single night would be continuously practicing the neurochemical pathways of fight or flight.
Oh, wow.
When a real leopard attacked the next day, their survival reflexes would be primed and optimized. They survived to pass on their genes.
I want to push back on that, though. We aren't being hunted by leopards anymore, so why do modern teenagers dream about failing a math test? Or adults dream about showing up to a boardroom naked? How does failing a dream math test help me survive?
Because the threats have evolved, but the simulation software remains exactly the same.
Oh, that's interesting.
In the modern world, our most pressing threats to survival are no longer physical predators. They are social and status predators. Being ostracized from your community, losing your job, or failing an evaluation are profound threats to your modern survival.
So the brain adapts the simulation.
Your brain takes the ancient software designed for leopard attacks and feeds it the modern data of social anxiety. You are rehearsing for social failure so you can avoid it in waking life.
That perfectly connects the evolutionary biology to modern anxiety.
It really does.
The second major modern theory is memory consolidation. We touch on this with the sleep spindles in stage 2, but it happens extensively in REM sleep as well. The continuity hypothesis suggests the brain is replaying the day's events, figuring out what data to keep and what to discard.
But the timeline of what it replays is where the real mechanism is revealed. It's known as the dream lag effect.
Right. If I get into a minor car accident on Monday, I don't necessarily dream about it on Monday night.
Exactly. Researchers have found that significant experiences are most likely to appear in your dreams 5 to 7 days after the event occurs.
Why the delay? Why wait a week?
Because that timeline perfectly mirrors the biological transit time it takes for the brain to move a memory from the short-term processing center of the hippocampus into the permanent storage network of the cerebral cortex.
So the dream is part of the transfer process.
The dream lag effect suggests that the dream you experience on day 6 might literally be the subjective psychological experience of that specific memory being permanently archived into your long-term identity.
A dream is the feeling of a memory being saved to the hard drive. That is incredible.
It's a beautiful way to think about it.
But that brings us to the third big theory, and the one that feels the most emotionally profound, the emotional regulation theory, pioneered by Matthew Walker.
Yes, Walker proposes that REM sleep provides a form of overnight therapy. It strips the visceral emotional sting away from our difficult or traumatic memories.
And the mechanism relies entirely on a specific, extreme neurochemical shift that happens only during REM sleep.
It does.
Well, let's make sure we clarify this mechanism because it's the key to the whole theory.
During your waking life, and even during non-REM sleep, your brain is constantly bathed in a chemical called norepinephrine.
Okay, norepinephrine.
It is essentially the brain's equivalent of adrenaline. It's the stress chemical. It makes your heart pound, your palms sweat, and triggers the physical sensation of anxiety.
Got it.
But when you enter REM sleep, the release of norepinephrine is completely shut off. It drops to absolute zero.
Zero.
REM sleep is the only time in the 24-hour cycle that your brain is entirely free of this stress chemical.
I love the analogy of a bomb squad defusing a device in a vacuum chamber. During REM sleep, the brain deliberately reactivates the traumatic or stressful memory the bomb detonates.
Yes.
But because there is zero norepinephrine in the brain, it's like detonating the bomb in a room with no oxygen. The explosion of the memory happens, but there is no chemical oxygen to feed the fire of the physiological stress response.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it. The brain divorces the informational content of the memory from the visceral emotional pain. It processes the data of the trauma in a perfectly safe, chemically calm environment.
Which means what for the next day?
This allows you to wake up the next day remembering the hard lessons of your life without being continually paralyzed by the trauma of them.
The brain is taking the sharp edges off our lives while we sleep.
Exactly.
But if dreaming is overnight therapy and threat rehearsal, what happens when the therapy gets stuck on repeat? What happens when the biological boundaries of the dream world break down? This brings us to the edge cases.
Right. And when we look at the edge cases, we see exactly how fragile and critical this system really is.
Let's start with nightmares.
We know that 5 to 8% of adults suffer from frequent nightmares, with a massive statistical peak occurring during our teens and 20s.
Which aligns perfectly with the threat simulation theory, since the teens and 20s are a period of intense social stress, identity formation, and peer evaluation. The threat simulator is working overtime.
But there is a point where the threat simulator stops being functional and becomes a pathology.
Yeah.
If we look at post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, through the lens of Matthew Walker's emotional regulation theory, we see a heartbreaking mechanical failure in the brain's chemistry.
The overnight therapy stops working.
In a healthy brain, as we discussed, a traumatic memory is replayed during REM sleep without norepinephrine, allowing the emotional sting to be removed. But in a patient with PTSD, a neurochemical glitch occurs.
What happens?
The norepinephrine fails to drop. The stress chemical remains artificially high during REM sleep.
So the brain pulls up the traumatic memory to process it, but the vacuum chamber is full of oxygen.
Yes, the brain replays the trauma, but because the stress chemical is present, the emotional pain isn't stripped away. The memory remains just as raw, just as terrifying, and just as deeply wired to the fear centers as the day the event actually happened.
That is awful.
The dream isn't processing the file, it is a corrupted file looping endlessly, reinforcing the trauma rather than healing it.
That mechanism completely changes how we should view PTSD. The brain is desperately trying to heal itself using its natural mechanism, but the chemical environment is broken. Are there ways to manually fix that specific broken loop?
Yes, and the most effective treatments align perfectly with the theory. There is a psychological approach called image rehearsal therapy, or IRT.
How does that work?
During the waking day, a patient consciously writes out the narrative of their recurring nightmare, but they deliberately rewrite the ending to something safe, victorious, or neutral.
So they change the script.
Yes, and they mentally rehearse this new, non-threatening script repeatedly. Over time, this conscious rehearsal creates a competing neural pathway that eventually overrides the corrupted file in the sleep cycle.
They are manually patching the software.
Exactly.
What about a chemical patch?
Doctors frequently prescribe a medication called prazosin for PTSD-induced nightmares. Prazosin was originally developed as a blood pressure medication. It's an alpha-1 blocker.
Okay.
But crucially, it crosses the blood-brain barrier and blocks norepinephrine receptors in the brain.
Ah,
By taking prazosin before bed, the patient artificially creates that low-stress chemical bath that their traumatized brain is failing to create on its own. It suppresses the stress response, allowing the emotional processing of REM sleep to finally take place.
that is just phenomenal. Identifying the missing chemical and replacing it to let the brain do its own therapy.
It's a huge breakthrough.
Let's talk about less extreme loops, though. Recurring dreams. The outline poses a great question. Why do I still dream about failing a college exam at age 50?
A very common experience.
Right. I know so many highly successful, capable adults who wake up in a cold sweat because they dreamed they forgot their locker combination or walked into a high school math final they never studied for. Why is the brain stuck on high school?
We call this the unfinished business hypothesis. When you have a recurring dream, it usually means there is a psychological conflict or a generalized stressor in your waking life that your brain hasn't resolved.
Okay, but what about the math test?
To address the 50-year-old taking a college exam, the dream isn't actually about the exam.
It's an efficiency mechanism, isn't it?
Let's expand on that. Think about your life at age 18 or 20. The most intense, easily definable, universally understood anxiety you faced was academic evaluation.
For sure.
The stakes felt existential, the deadline was absolute, you had no control over the questions, and an authority figure was judging you. Your brain encoded that highly specific scenario sitting at a desk with a blank test as its ultimate, most efficient template for the feeling of being evaluated and found wanting.
So, cut to 3 decades later. I am 50 years old. I'm stressed about a presentation at work, or maybe I'm feeling inadequate in my marriage.
Right.
My brain says, okay, we have a massive load of generalized anxiety to process tonight. What's the fastest way to simulate the feeling of being judged and unprepared? Pull up the college biology exam file.
Exactly. It's the brain's default user interface for stress. It doesn't need to build a new simulation about your marriage. The math test simulation triggers the exact same emotional circuits much more efficiently.
That makes me feel so much better about dreaming about high school.
You're definitely not alone.
So we've talked about being trapped in nightmares. Let's look at the people who figure out how to wake up inside the simulation. Lucid dreaming. For a long time, this sounded like New Age mysticism, but it is deeply grounded in rigorous science.
Oh, absolutely. Lucid dreaming occurs when you are in the middle of a REM cycle, deeply immersed in a dream, and suddenly the prefrontal cortex flickers back online just enough to trigger a conscious realization.
Wait, this isn't real. I am dreaming.
Exactly. And with that realization comes conscious agency. You can dictate the narrative, alter the environment, or choose to fly.
But the scientific community rejected this for decades. And you can see why. How do you prove it? A subject wakes up in a lab and says, I consciously knew I was dreaming. And the skeptical scientist replies, no, you just dreamed that you knew you were dreaming. It was an unfalsifiable claim.
It was entirely subjective and unfalsifiable.
Yeah.
Until a brilliantly elegant experiment in 1975.
Who figured it out?
A British psychologist named Keith Hearn and independently Stephen LaBerge at Stanford cracked the code. They realized there was a biological loophole in the paralysis of REM sleep.
The eyes.
The eyes. During REM sleep, the brainstem sends the signal to paralyze your voluntary muscles, your arms, legs, neck, but it does not paralyze your extraocular muscles. Your eyes are darting around rapidly.
Okay, so how did they use that?
LaBerge and Hearn took subjects who claimed to be expert lucid dreamers, put them in a sleep lab, wired them up to an EEG to monitor brain waves, and gave them a simple instruction before they went to sleep.
Which was?
When you realize you are dreaming, look left, right, left, right, left, right with your physical eyes.
I want the listener to picture this scene in the lab. The subject is asleep. The EEG proves, objectively, that their brain is in deep REM sleep. The body is completely paralyzed. And then suddenly, on the polygraph, tracking the eye muscles, left, right, left, right, left, right.
It was a spectacular moment in the history of science. It was a fully conscious, waking mind trapped inside a paralyzed, sleeping body, sending a deliberate Morse code signal out to the waking world to say, I am awake in here.
It's like an astronaut communicating from the far side of the moon. And it isn't rare. The data shows that up to 55% of people experience a lucid dream at least once in their lives.
And it is a skill that can be trained. The most empirically validated method is LaBerge's mild-D technique mnemonic induction of lucid dreams.
How do you do it?
You wake up briefly during the night, recall the dream you were just having, and then tell yourself repeatedly with deep intention as you fall back asleep, next time I am dreaming, I will remember that I am dreaming.
People also use reality testing, right?
Yes, they build a habit of constantly checking their environment during the day. For example, looking at a digital clock, looking away and looking back.
Because in reality, the time stays the same.
Exactly. But in a dream, the brain struggles to render stable text or numbers, so the clock might suddenly display alien symbols. If you build a habit of checking the clock in waking life, that habit bleeds into your dream life, triggers the glitch, and wakes up your conscious mind.
What is truly fascinating to me is the practical application of this state. Studies have shown that you can physically practice motor skills while lucid dreaming.
Yes, you can.
So if I practice shooting a basketball or playing a piano scale in a lucid dream, am I actually better at it when I wake up?
Yes, you are measurably better. Remember, your motor cortex is fully active during REM sleep. When you consciously practice a piano scale in a lucid dream, the brain fires the exact sequence of neurons required for that physical movement. The brain does not distinguish between a vividly imagined, neurologically enacted movement and a physical one when it comes to myelinating those neural pathways. You are strengthening the biological wiring of the skill while physically paralyzed in bed.
That is literally hacking the human nervous system.
It is.
But lucid dreaming is what happens when you gain conscious control inside the safe biological container of REM sleep. What happens when that biological container itself fails? When the hardware separating the dream world from the waking world physically malfunctions?
This takes us into the realm of sleep disorders. Examining when the system breaks down gives us incredible insight into how the machinery is supposed to work.
Right. Let's look at REM sleep behavior disorder, or RBD. We discussed the critical safety mechanism of REM atonia, the paralysis of your muscles.
Yes, in RBD, that specific brainstem paralysis switch fails to flip.
So the simulation is running, the motor cortex is firing the commands, but the spinal cord isn't blocking them. The muscles are entirely active.
The sleeper physically acts out their dreams. If they're dreaming about fighting off an attacker, they will punch, kick, and thrash in their actual bed.
Which is super dangerous.
They might leap out of bed and run into a wall. It can be incredibly dangerous, leading to severe injuries for the sleeper and their partner.
But beyond the immediate physical danger, RBD carries a chilling predictive medical implication. This was the most sobering statistic in the entire source document for me. What is the link between RBD and neurodegenerative disease?
If an adult over the age of 50 develops idiopathic RBD, meaning the disorder appears out of nowhere without an obvious cause like a new medication, there is an 80 to 90% chance that they will develop Parkinson's disease or a related condition like Lewy body dementia within 10 to 15 years.
80 to 90%, that is a massive, almost guaranteed correlation. Why does the dream boundary failing predict a movement disorder a decade later?
It comes down to how the disease physically spreads through the brain. Parkinson's is caused by the misfolding and accumulation of a protein called alpha-synuclein. These toxic clumps, called Lewy bodies, don't start in the motor control centers of the brain. They seem to originate lower down in the brainstem. The specific brainstem nuclei responsible for controlling REM sleep paralysis are apparently among the very first neural regions to be damaged by this protein.
The dream boundary failing is the canary in the coal mine. It's an early warning system firing a decade before a hand tremor ever shows up.
Yes, exactly.
That is terrifying, but also offers an incredible window for early detection and future neuroprotective treatments. Now, let's look at the exact opposite of RBD. What happens when the paralysis mechanism works too well?
You're referring to sleep paralysis. In RBD, the paralysis fails to start. In sleep paralysis, the atonia persists after the brain has already woken up.
So you're awake but stuck.
You open your eyes, you are fully conscious, you are looking at your bedroom ceiling, but the brainstem has not released the chemical lock on your spinal cord. You cannot move a single voluntary muscle. You are locked inside your own body.
I have experienced this once, and it is sheer, unadulterated terror. You feel this immense, crushing weight on your chest like you can't breathe.
That crushing sensation is a highly common symptom,
Right.
and there is a mechanical reason for it. Your conscious mind is awake, so you expect to be able to take a deep, voluntary breath.
Right.
But your autonomic nervous system is still running the shallow, irregular breathing program of REM sleep. You feel like you are suffocating because you cannot consciously control your diaphragm.
That makes so much sense.
But the physical paralysis is only half of the experience. Sleep paralysis is frequently accompanied by hypnopompic hallucinations.
Meaning the dream world is still actively projecting its simulation onto the waking world.
Yes. Your visual cortex and your emotional centers are still firing the REM sequence. So your brain overlays a hallucinated dream figure directly into your actual bedroom.
Oh.
And remember, the amygdala, the fear center, is highly active. You are paralyzed, your fear center is firing, so the hallucination is almost universally interpreted as a malevolent presence. You sense something evil in the corner of the room or sitting directly on your chest.
This was a massive aha moment for me when reading the outline. This mechanical glitch perfectly explains centuries of folklore.
Oh, absolutely. If you look back through history, sleep paralysis with hypnopompic hallucinations is the exact mechanical explanation for countless supernatural encounters.
Like what?
The Scandinavian folklore of the Maranai, an evil spirit that rides on a sleeping person's chest, which is literally where we get the word nightmare. The medieval European belief in succubi and incubi demons attacking people in their beds.
It even explains modern reports of alien abductions. People describe waking up paralyzed, sensing a gray, faceless presence leaning over their bed, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, and being unable to scream.
It's the exact same script.
They aren't lying about their experience. They are accurately reporting a neurobiological glitch where the boundary between the dream and reality temporarily dissolved.
It is the exact same underlying mechanism. And we see another severe boundary failure in narcolepsy.
How does narcolepsy fit into the REM architecture?
Narcolepsy is a dramatic failure of the sleep-wake boundary, caused by a deficit of hypocretin, a neuropeptide that regulates wakefulness.
So the barrier is just weak.
Exactly. For a person with narcolepsy, the brain cannot maintain the barrier. They can plunge directly from waking life straight into REM sleep in a matter of seconds. The dream hallucinations bleed seamlessly into the daytime, and the REM atonia, the paralysis, can trigger while they are awake and experiencing strong emotions, causing them to physically collapse.
The more we explore the hardware, the more I realize how incredibly complex and foundational this nightly ritual is. We've tried to explain it through gods and demons, but when we look back across history and even across the animal kingdom, we see how deeply baked into biology this really is.
The historical continuity is remarkable. We mentioned the ancient Mesopotamians and Egyptians earlier.
Right.
The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest recorded stories in human history dating back to 2100 BCE, centers heavily on prophetic dreams guiding the hero. The ancient Egyptians didn't just casually discuss dreams, they wrote extensive formalized dream books to interpret the symbols.
The perspective I found most deeply poetic in the source text was the Aboriginal Australian concept of the dream time.
Yes.
They don't view dreams as an illusion or as something less real than waking life. They view the dream state as differently real. It is a foundational, spiritual reality parallel to our own that you touch when you sleep.
And while a modern neuroscientist uses entirely different vocabulary, they would conceptually agree that the dreaming state is touching a foundational biological reality, because we are far from the only species doing this.
This is where we look at the animal kingdom. I watch my dog sleep on the rug. His paws are twitching, his eyes are rolling under his lids, and he lets out these little muffled barks. He is definitively dreaming about chasing a squirrel in the yard.
And science rigorously backs up your observation. We have identified the specific EEG signatures of REM sleep in all mammals studied and in birds.
So it's everywhere.
Your dog is absolutely dreaming, cats dream, horses, elephants, and dolphins dream.
And the source text notes that the platypus gets 8 hours of REM sleep a day. A platypus is spending a third of its life hallucinating.
The sheer prevalence of REM sleep across such diverse species suggests that dreaming is an evolutionarily ancient mechanism. It is not a recent psychological development. But the definitive proof of what animals are actually experiencing during REM sleep came from a landmark, incredibly elegant study in 2001 at MIT.
Oh, conducted by researchers Matthew Wilson and Kenway Louie. I want to spend time on this MIT rat experiment because the methodology proves exactly what a dream is. Walk us through how they actually measured a rat's dream.
Wilson and Louie implanted microscopic electrodes directly into the hippocampus of rats. The hippocampus is heavily involved in spatial navigation.
Okay, spatial navigation.
During the day, they let the rats run through a physical circular maze to find food. As the rat navigated the maze, the electrodes recorded the exact, specific firing pattern of individual neurons.
They mapped the brain's GPS.
Exactly. They are called place cells. When the rat passed corner A, a specific neuron fired. When it passed corner B, another neuron fired. They mapped the unique neural signature of running that specific maze.
So they have the waking baseline data. They know exactly what it looks like neurologically when the rat is running the maze. What happens when the rat goes to sleep?
The rat falls asleep and eventually enters REM sleep. The researchers watch the monitors, and suddenly the exact same sequence of neurons begins to fire.
Cell A, then cell B, then cell C.
With the exact same sequential timing.
The rat is literally running the maze in its sleep.
Yes. The researchers could look at the neural readouts on the monitor and tell you exactly which part of the maze the rat was dreaming about navigating at any given second.
That is just wild.
What's even more fascinating is the speed of the playback. During sleep, the neural sequence often fired much faster than it did in waking life. The rat was fast-forwarding through the memory to consolidate the spatial data.
To learn it better.
Exactly. This proved, undeniably, that animals replay their waking experiences during sleep. Dreaming is not some uniquely human psychological quirk. It is a fundamental, deeply rooted biological mechanism for learning, memory consolidation, and survival across species.
Which brings us to the ultimate contradiction of this entire deep dive.
The forgetting.
Yes, if this mechanism is so biologically vital, if it's helping rats learn mazes, if it's giving humans overnight trauma therapy, if it's simulating life and death threats to keep us alive, why does the brain aggressively hit the delete button the moment we wake up? Why do we forget the vast majority of these experiences?
It feels like a massive design flaw, doesn't it?
It totally does. You spend all this energy generating a world and then you throw it in the trash.
But it is actually a highly functional feature. And the explanation brings us right back to the neurochemistry we discussed earlier, norepinephrine.
The stress chemical that drops to absolute zero during REM sleep so we can process trauma?
Exactly. Norepinephrine does not merely mediate the stress response. It is a critical chemical requirement for encoding new memories into long-term storage.
Oh, wait.
If you do not have norepinephrine present in the brain, you cannot hit save on a new experience.
Let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around this mechanism. The very chemical absence that allows us to process our traumatic memories safely is the exact same chemical absence that makes it physically impossible to remember the dream itself.
Precisely. You experience the dream vividly in the moment, but because the encoding chemical is turned off, the memory trace of the dream dissolves almost immediately upon waking. The system prioritizes emotional healing over conscious recall.
That is painfully elegant. And there is a structural issue with the hippocampus at play here too, right?
Yes. Think about what the hippocampus is actively doing during REM sleep. It is busy pulling up old memories from the archives, reviewing them, and sending them out to the cortex for permanent storage.
Okay.
If the hippocampus was simultaneously trying to record the dream itself as a brand new incoming memory, you would create an infinite regression loop.
Oh, I see. It would be like pointing a video camera directly at the monitor that is playing the camera's live feed. You just get a mirrored infinite tunnel of visual noise.
That's it, exactly. The brain elegantly avoids this feedback loop by simply suppressing the recording function while the archiving processing function is running.
But wait, we do remember some dreams. Like, I can vividly describe a dream I had last night. If the system is designed to delete them, how do we ever remember them? What is the actionable advice for the listener who wants to capture these 100,000 realities?
It is entirely about how you handle the delicate transition from the norepinephrine-free REM state to the waking state. The absolute necessity is the immediate use of a dream journal.
Immediate being the key word.
The window of recall is incredibly narrow, usually only about 30 to 60 seconds after your eyes open. If you wake up, look at your phone, think about the emails you have to send, or even physically get out of bed to walk to the bathroom, the fragile memory trace is instantly overwritten by waking sensory data.
It's just gone.
You have to lie perfectly still and write it down the very second you wake up.
And the way you wake up matters immensely, too. Alarms are terrible for dream recall.
Alarms violently shatter the recall window. They jolt you out of sleep abruptly, and often they wake you from a non-REM stage if they interrupt the cycle. Waking naturally and gradually allows the brain to transition smoothly out of REM sleep, giving your conscious mind a much better chance to carry the memory trace across the boundary before it dissolves.
The research also points out that there are individual structural differences. Some people are just naturally prolific dream recallers.
Psychological traits certainly play a role. People who score high on the personality trait of openness to experience, people who are naturally curious, introspective, and creative, tend to remember significantly more dreams.
That makes sense.
But neurologically, it comes down to a brain region called the temporoparietal junction, or TPJ.
What does the TPJ actually do?
In waking life, the TPJ integrates information from your external environment and your internal body state to give you a sense of self and space. Studies show that high dream recallers have significantly higher spontaneous activity in the TPJ during sleep.
So they are more aware.
Because this area is highly sensitive to external stimuli, these individuals tend to have more frequent micro-awakenings during the night. They might wake up for just 2 or 3 seconds, not enough to remember waking up, but just long enough for the brain to hit save on the dream before dipping back into sleep.
And on the flip side, there are things that actively destroy dream recall. If you are consuming alcohol heavily before bed, or if you are on certain SSRI antidepressants, your dream recall is going to plummet.
Because both alcohol and many SSRIs severely suppress REM sleep architecture. Alcohol might help you fall asleep, but it fragments the night and blocks the brain from entering REM. If you aren't having REM sleep, you simply aren't having the vivid, narrative dreams to remember.
Which is an incredibly important conversation to have with your doctor if you feel like your sleep is completely devoid of dreaming, especially if you are on medication. Okay. We have covered the architecture, the neuroscience, the psychology, the edge cases, the animal kingdom, and the amnesia. But the source text leaves us on a massive philosophical cliffhanger. The hard problem.
The philosopher David Chalmers famously coined this the hard problem of consciousness. And the phenomenon of dreaming makes the problem incredibly acute.
We know the mechanics. We know the hippocampus is firing to consolidate spatial memory. We know the visual cortex is active. We know the amygdala is processing emotion. We know norepinephrine drops to 0. But why does that sequence of neural electrical activity produce an experience?
That remains the ultimate mystery. Think about a computer. A computer can consolidate data, run threat simulations, and delete temporary files entirely in the dark.
Right.
It doesn't need to put on a 3D, phenomenological, emotionally resonant movie to do its filing. Why does the human brain generate a conscious, subjective experience while doing its biological maintenance? Why does it feel like something to dream?
And we don't have an answer to that, do we?
We do not. We can map the machinery perfectly. We can track the calcium ions in the glial cells. But how physical, electrical impulses transmute into the vivid, terrifying, or beautiful subjective experience of a dream remains the great unsolved mystery of human existence.
Let's bring this all together for you, the listener. Tonight, when you lie down in the dark and close your eyes, remember what is about to happen. Your brain is going to deliberately suppress its logic center. It is going to flood its emotional threat centers. It is going to send a chemical signal to completely sever the connection to your muscles, paralyzing your body. And then in that paralyzed state is going to build an entire breathtaking universe from scratch, just to process your day, heal your traumas, and help you survive tomorrow.
It is a profound, incredibly dynamic, nightly ritual of self-creation, therapy, and biological maintenance.
I want to leave you with one final mind-bending thought from the source text. Think about this deeply. During a dream, your visual cortex builds a completely convincing 3D reality entirely without external sensory input. You inhabit it and you believe it completely, but your visual cortex uses the exact same biological machinery to process your waking life.
The exact same neural networks generate the imagery.
Which means right now, as you are listening to this, you are still actively hallucinating your reality inside the dark, sealed theater of your skull. It just so happens that while you are awake, your ongoing hallucinations are constrained and corrected by outside data from your eyes and ears. Waking life is just a dream with sensory guardrails.
It is a staggering realization. The world you experience, whether awake or asleep, is always generated from within.
Sleep well and pay attention to where you go.